What would you do if a single whispered word changed the course of your entire life? If one moment of courage, speaking when you had been taught your whole existence to remain silent, suddenly made the most powerful man in England truly see you for the very first time? Welcome back to the Duke's Revenge, my friends. I've missed you. Before we begin tonight's story, tell me where you're listening from. City, country, time zone. I read every single comment, and your messages from around the world remind me why I love doing this. Tonight's tale is one that has stayed with me since I first began researching it. It's about a woman who had been trained since childhood to be invisible, to exist in the margins of other people's lives, to serve without being seen, to know without speaking. And it's about a duke who had forgotten that true intelligence has nothing to do with bloodlines or bank accounts, and everything to do with the courage to speak truth to power. But here's what makes this story different from the others I've told you. This isn't just a tale of revenge against those who wronged her. This is a story about a man's revenge against himself, against the cold, calculating person he had allowed himself to become, and the awakening that came in the form of 4 whispered words that saved him from ruin. Let me take you back to a gray November afternoon in 1847, to a mahogany-paneled study in London, where the air hung heavy with the scent of ink and old money, and where a governess was about to do something that governesses were never, ever supposed to do. Part 1. The Whisper. Da Bahadur. The pen hovered above the contract. Julian Vance, the 7th Duke of Ashworth, had read the document 3 times. His solicitor, Mr. Theodore Crawley, sat across from him with the barely concealed satisfaction of a man who had negotiated a masterpiece. The terms were favorable, extraordinarily so. The Whitmore Railway Company would receive £80,000 of the Duke's capital in exchange for shares that promised to triple in value within 2 years. Now, it's important to understand what £80,000 meant in 1847 England. To put this in perspective, a skilled tradesman might earn £50 in an entire year. A comfortable middle-class family could live quite well on £300 annually. A country vicar considered himself fortunate to receive £200. £80,000 was not merely a fortune, it was a dynasty. It was the kind of money that built hospitals and funded universities, that purchased parliamentary seats and altered the course of political history. When we speak of such sums, we are speaking of power in its most concentrated form. And yet, for the Duke of Ashworth, it represented merely a fraction of his holdings, a calculated risk in a portfolio already so vast that most men could not comprehend its scope. "The terms are quite exceptional, Your Grace," Crawley murmured, his spectacles catching the gray light from the window. "Mr. Whitmore has been most accommodating. The deadline of November 15th gives us ample time to arrange the transfer of funds and the profit projections. I've seen the projections." The Duke's voice was cool, detached, the voice of a man who had learned long ago that emotion was a weakness to be excised from all business dealings. 34, Julian Vance had built a reputation as one of the most formidable financial minds in England. Where other aristocrats squandered their inheritances on horses and gaming tables, the Duke of Ashworth had doubled his family's already considerable fortune through shrewd investments, ruthless negotiations, and an almost preternatural ability to sense when a deal was about to turn sour. He had never lost. Not once. The pen touched paper. Julian began to form the first letter of his signature. "Your Grace." The voice came from the doorway. Soft. Female. Entirely unexpected. Julian's hand stilled. Slowly, he raised his eyes. She stood at the threshold of his study, a place where she had absolutely no business being. Miss Marguerite Holloway, the governess he had hired 6 months ago to educate his ward, a distant cousin's orphaned daughter named Phoebe. Miss Holloway was perhaps 24, though she carried herself with the composed gravity of someone far older. Her hair was the color of dark honey, pulled back severely from a face that might have been called striking if anyone had bothered to look closely enough. Her gown was the unremarkable gray of her profession, designed to be overlooked, to blend into wallpaper, to exist without calling attention to itself. In the 6 months she had resided at Ashworth House, Julian had spoken to her perhaps 4 times. He knew she was competent. Phoebe's French had improved markedly, and the child had developed an unexpected interest in mathematics. But beyond that, Miss Holloway existed in his consciousness as a vague, gray-toned presence, a piece of necessary furniture, a function rather than a person. Until now. Now, she stood in his doorway with something burning in her dark eyes, something that looked almost like fear. No, not fear. Urgency. Miss Holloway. His voice could have frozen the Thames. You forget yourself. I am in the middle of important business. I know, Your Grace. She did not move, did not curtsy, did not lower her gaze as a woman of her station should. That is precisely why I am here. Crawley made a small, scandalized sound. Really, this is most irregular. Your Grace, shall I have the servants remove? That date is wrong. 4 words, spoken barely above a whisper, and yet they landed in the room like cannon fire. Julian's pen hovered, frozen above the contract. I beg your pardon? Miss Holloway took a step into the study. Her hands were clasped before her. He noticed they were trembling slightly, but her voice remained steady. The deadline, Your Grace. The contract states November 15th, 1847. But Mr. Whitmore's original prospectus, the one you reviewed last month, listed the completion deadline as November 15th, 1846. A year ago. The railway was supposed to be operational by now. It isn't. Silence. Crawley let out a nervous laugh. My dear woman, you cannot possibly expect us to believe that a governess— The prospectus was left in the library, Miss Holloway continued, her eyes fixed on the Duke's face. After Phoebe's geography lesson on Tuesday, I was returning the atlas to its proper shelf when I noticed the documents on the reading table. I did not intend to read them, Your Grace, but the date caught my eye. It seemed unusual. A completion deadline that had already passed, now quietly moved forward by 12 months in the investment contract, with no explanation for the delay. Julian's mind was racing now, even as his expression remained carved from stone. The prospectus. Yes, he had reviewed it in the library before sending it to Crawley for verification. He remembered seeing dates, timelines, engineering assessments. But the completion deadline, had he truly overlooked it? Had he assumed it was merely a projection rather than a contractual obligation? You're suggesting the project is behind schedule, he said slowly. I am suggesting, Your Grace, that if the original deadline was legitimate, and if that deadline passed a year ago without the railway being completed, then either the Whitmore Railway Company has encountered serious difficulties they have not disclosed to potential investors, or the prospectus contained false information from the beginning. She paused, and something flickered across her features. I also noticed that the engineering surveys were signed by a Mr. Harold Pemberton. I recognized the name. He was dismissed from the Royal Society of Engineers 3 years ago for falsifying geological assessments. My father— She stopped abruptly. Your father. Julian's voice was sharp now, interested despite himself. For the first time, her composure cracked, just slightly. A shadow passed across her features, there and gone in an instant. But Julian caught it. Pain. Old pain, carefully buried. My father was Professor Leonard Holloway, she said quietly. He held the chair of applied mathematics at Cambridge for 18 years. He consulted on railway engineering projects throughout England and wrote extensively on the proper methodology for route surveys. He died 4 years ago, but before his death, he was asked to review Pemberton's work on the Bristol line. He found significant irregularities, fabricated soil samples, invented gradient measurements. The Royal Society investigated, and Pemberton was expelled. She met the Duke's eyes directly. The same Harold Pemberton, whose signature appears on every engineering document in your prospectus. The silence that followed was absolute. Julian set down his pen. The small click of silver against mahogany seemed very loud in the stillness. "Leave us," he said to Crawley. "Your Grace, I must protest." "Now." The solicitor gathered his papers with trembling hands and departed, casting a venomous glance at Miss Holloway as he passed. She did not flinch. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped, her breathing carefully controlled, but Julian could see the pulse jumping at the base of her throat. She was terrified. And yet, she had not retreated. When the door closed, Julian rose from his desk and walked slowly toward her. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that made other men step back instinctively. His features were severe, a strong jaw, sharp cheekbones, eyes the color of winter storms. He had been told by various society matrons that he was handsome, but he had never given the matter much thought. Appearance was merely another tool, another asset to be leveraged when necessary. He stopped 3 feet from Miss Holloway, close enough to see the individual threads of gray in her modest gown, close enough to smell the faint scent of lavender and old books that clung to her. "Do you have any idea," he said softly, "what you have just done?" She swallowed. "I have spoken out of turn, Your Grace. I have overstepped every boundary of my position. I have inserted myself into matters that are none of my concern." She raised her chin, and in that moment, Julian saw something in her eyes that made his breath catch. Not fear, but a fierce, burning dignity. "And I have quite possibly saved you from losing £80,000 to a fraudulent scheme. You presume to know more about business than my solicitor, than my advisors, than myself. No, Your Grace, I presume to have read a document carefully, to have recognized a name I knew, and to have possessed enough conscience that I could not remain silent, while you signed away a fortune to criminals." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, but she did not look away. "If I am wrong, if the Whitmore Railway Company is legitimate, and I have simply misunderstood, then I will accept whatever consequences you deem appropriate. Dismissal without reference. Public humiliation. Whatever you wish, but I could not watch you sign that contract without speaking." Julian studied her face. In all his years of business dealings, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect deception. He had ruined men who tried to lie to him, had destroyed schemes that others considered undetectable. And now, looking into Marguerite Holloway's eyes, he saw nothing but truth. Truth and something else, something that looked almost like grief. "Your father," he said, "Professor Holloway. You said he died 4 years ago." "Yes, Your Grace. And before that, he was a respected scholar, a man of considerable reputation." "Yes." "How does the daughter of a Cambridge professor come to be a governess?" For the first time, her composure truly wavered. She looked away, her jaw tightening, and Julian saw her hands clench at her sides. "That," she said quietly, "is not relevant to the matter at hand. I will decide what is relevant." He walked past her to the door, opening it to summon a footman. "Send word to have Mr. Silas Whitmore brought to this house immediately, and have Mrs. Drummond prepare the blue drawing room for an extended discussion." He turned back to Miss Holloway. You will remain in this house until I have investigated your claims. If you are correct, you will be rewarded. If you are wrong—" He let the sentence hang, unfinished. "And if I am correct," she said, her voice very low, "what will happen to Mr. Whitmore?" Julian's smile was cold. "I think you already know the answer to that, Miss Holloway. I think that's precisely why you warned me." He saw understanding dawn in her eyes. She knew what kind of man he was. She knew what he did to those who tried to deceive him. And she had warned him anyway, not to save him, he realized, but to ensure that justice would be done. In that moment, for the first time in years, Julian Vance felt something shift inside his chest, a hairline crack in the ice he had spent decades building around his heart. He told himself it meant nothing. He was wrong. Come. Part 2. The Invisible Woman. 8 months earlier, Marguerite Holloway had stood in the rain outside the servants' entrance of Ashworth House, clutching a letter of recommendation that was worth less than the paper it was printed on. The rain had soaked through her cloak, plastering her hair to her face, seeping into her worn boots until her toes were numb. She had been standing there for 20 minutes, waiting for someone to answer her knock, and with each passing moment, the voice in her head had grown louder. "You don't belong here. You will never belong anywhere again. You are nothing now. Less than nothing. The daughter of a disgraced man. The remnant of a family that no longer exists. Now, I want to pause here to explain something about the position of a governess in Victorian England, because it's crucial to understanding Marguerite's situation. A governess occupied one of the most peculiar positions in the social hierarchy of the time. She was neither servant nor family, belonging fully to neither world. She was expected to be educated enough to teach the children of the wealthy, refined enough to mold them into proper ladies and gentlemen, and yet humble enough to remember that she was, at her core, an employee. She ate alone, apart from both the servants and the family. She was not invited to social gatherings. She could not form friendships with those above or below her station without violating the unwritten rules that governed English society. She existed in a kind of social limbo, visible enough to be useful, invisible enough to be forgotten. For a woman like Marguerite, a woman who had once dined at high table in Cambridge colleges, who had discussed philosophy with some of the finest minds in England, who had been raised to believe that intelligence was the greatest virtue and learning the highest calling, this invisibility was a particular kind of torture. Every day, she swallowed her knowledge, hid her capabilities, performed the role of a humble servant, while her mind screamed for engagement, for challenge, for someone, anyone, to see her as more than a gray-gowned function. The door had finally opened to reveal Mrs. Drummond, the housekeeper, a woman with steel-gray hair and eyes to match. She had looked Marguerite up and down with the practiced assessment of someone who had spent 40 years evaluating servants, and her expression had been unreadable. "You're the new governess, then. You're late." "I apologize. The coach from Cambridge was delayed by flooding on. I don't need excuses, girl. I need punctuality." Mrs. Drummond had stepped back to allow her entry. "The Duke is a man of precision. He expects everyone in this household to operate with the same efficiency as his investments. You would do well to remember that." Marguerite had followed the housekeeper through winding corridors, past kitchens that smelled of roasting meat, past storage rooms stacked with linens, past the invisible machinery that kept a great house running. The servants' quarters were plain but clean, far better, she thought bitterly, than the lodging house where she had spent the past 3 months, counting her remaining coins and wondering how long she could survive before destitution claimed her entirely. "Your room," Mrs. Drummond had said, opening a door to reveal a small chamber with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window overlooking the mews. Your charge is Miss Phoebe Ashworth, the Duke's ward. She is 7 years old, recently orphaned, and has been described by her previous governesses, all 3 of them, as unmanageable." The housekeeper's mouth had twisted slightly. "The Duke has little patience for excuses where the child is concerned. He expects her to be educated to the standard of any young lady of quality. If you cannot achieve this, you will be dismissed. Is that understood?" "Perfectly, Mrs. Drummond." "Good. Dinner is at 6 in the servants' hall. You will meet Miss Phoebe in the schoolroom tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock sharp. Do not be late." And with that, Marguerite had been left alone in her small gray room, listening to the rain hammer against the window, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. That night, she had lain awake in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, and allowed herself, just for a moment, to remember. Her father's study in Cambridge, the walls lined with books, floor to ceiling, so many books that the room felt like a cave made of knowledge. The afternoon light, filtering through dusty windows, her father's voice, warm with pride, as he showed her how to solve a differential equation, how to analyze the stress patterns in a bridge design, how to spot the fatal flaw in a financial prospectus. "You have the finest mind I have ever encountered, Marguerite," he had told her. "Finer even than mine. It is a tragedy that the world will never allow you to use it fully." She had not understood then what he meant. She understood now. Professor Leonard Holloway had died in the autumn of 1843, and with him had died everything Marguerite had known. The comfortable house in Cambridge, rented, she discovered, not owned. The books, those precious, beloved books, sold to pay his debts. The endless stream of scholars and students who had gathered at her father's table to debate ideas that set her mind on fire, scattered, moved on, uninterested in the orphaned daughter of a dead colleague. She had been left with nothing. No inheritance, no prospects, no family, save for a brother who had emigrated to America 5 years earlier, seeking his fortune, and had died of fever in New York before he could establish himself. She was alone in the world, a 20-year-old woman with an education that would have been the envy of most Oxford graduates, and absolutely no way to use it. For a few months, she had survived on the charity of her father's former colleagues. But charity, she learned, has limits, especially for a young woman with no connections and no dowry. The wives of those kind professors had begun to look at her with suspicion. Was she trying to entrap their sons? The invitations to dinner had grown less frequent. The offers of temporary lodging had come with increasingly pointed suggestions that she ought to find a more permanent situation. And so Marguerite had done the only thing a respectable, educated woman without means could do. She had become a governess. Her first position had lasted 6 months. The master of the house, a portly baronet with wandering hands and sour breath, had cornered her in the library one evening and made his intentions unmistakably clear. "Come now, Miss Holloway," he had said, blocking the doorway with his bulk. "Surely you understand your position here. A woman, alone, without protection, without family. I could make your life very comfortable, or I could make it very difficult indeed." She had grabbed a brass candlestick from the mantel and swung it at his head. She had missed, barely, but the message had been clear. She had fled that night, leaving behind wages owed and a reference she desperately needed. Her second position had ended when the mistress of the house discovered that Marguerite could read Greek. "It is simply not natural," Lady Fenwick had declared, her face pale with something between fear and disgust. "A woman who reads Greek. What else might she be capable of? What ideas might she put into my daughters' heads?" Marguerite had been dismissed. Without explanation, her attempts to defend herself ignored. Her third position had been adequate, if joyless, until the family's financial troubles had forced them to let her go with apologies and a lukewarm letter of recommendation. And now, here she was. Ashworth House, her 4th position in 4 years, her last chance, she suspected, before she would be forced to consider less respectable options for survival. She would not think about those options. She would not. Part 3. The Fierce Child. The schoolroom at Ashworth House was on the 3rd floor, a bright, airy space with windows overlooking the garden. When Marguerite arrived at precisely 8 o'clock on her first morning, she found her charge already waiting. A small, fierce-eyed girl with copper hair that had clearly been brushed under protest, sitting with her arms crossed and her chin jutting forward in unmistakable defiance. "I don't want another governess," Phoebe announced before Marguerite could speak. "The last 3 were stupid, and I made them all cry." Marguerite set down her teaching materials and regarded the child calmly. "I see. And how, precisely, did you make them cry?" Something flickered in Phoebe's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that the new governess had not immediately started lecturing her about proper behavior. "I put a frog in Miss Whitby's bed. She screamed so loud the footman came running. And I told Miss Carter that her French pronunciation was so bad, even the kitchen cat wouldn't understand her." "And Miss Pennington?" "Let me guess. You hid her spectacles and watched her walk into walls?" Phoebe's mouth fell open. "How did you know?" "Because I did the same thing to my Latin tutor when I was 8. Marguerite pulled out a chair and sat down, bringing herself to Phoebe's eye level. "Mr. Henderson was a pompous man who believed that girls couldn't learn Latin, and he told my father so repeatedly. I decided to prove him wrong by memorizing the entire first book of the Aeneid in a week. When I recited it perfectly, he accused me of cheating, so I hid his spectacles." She smiled slightly. "He walked into a door frame and chipped his tooth." Phoebe stared at her. "You know Latin?" "Latin, Greek, French, German, and enough Italian to read Dante in the original. I also know mathematics through calculus, natural philosophy, history from the Greeks to the present day, and more about railway engineering than most men in Parliament." Marguerite leaned forward. "I am not stupid, Miss Phoebe, and I do not cry easily. So if you wish to be rid of me, you will have to try considerably harder than frogs and hidden spectacles." A long moment passed. Then slowly, the defiance in Phoebe's expression shifted into something else. Curiosity, respect, and beneath that, barely visible, a flicker of hope. "My mother knew Latin," Phoebe said quietly. "She used to read to me from a book of myths before she died." Marguerite felt something twist in her chest. "I'm sorry about your mother, Phoebe. Father died too, in the same carriage accident." The words were flat, rehearsed, the kind of statement a child makes when she has repeated it so many times it has lost all meaning. "His Grace is my guardian now. He's very rich, and very important and very busy, so I'm not supposed to bother him." "I see. He's also very cold. That's what the servants say. They say he has ice water in his veins instead of blood, and that he's never loved anyone in his whole life." Phoebe tilted her head. "Do you think that's true? That someone can go their whole life without loving anyone?" Marguerite thought of her father, of the way his eyes had lit up when she solved a difficult problem, the pride in his voice when he introduced her to his colleagues, the quiet evenings they had spent reading together by the fire. She thought of how much she had loved him, and how much that love had cost her when he was gone. "No," she said softly, "I don't think that's true. But I think some people learn to hide their love so well that others can't see it anymore. And I think some people are so afraid of losing what they love that they convince themselves they're better off not loving at all." Phoebe considered this. That's very sad. Yes, it is. Miss Holloway? Yes, Phoebe. I think I might like you. But don't tell anyone. I have a reputation to maintain. And despite everything, despite the weariness and the heartbreak and the grinding loneliness of the past 4 years, Marguerite laughed. Over the following months, something unexpected happened. Phoebe, the unmanageable child who had driven away 3 governesses, began to thrive. She discovered a passion for mathematics that surprised everyone, including herself. She read voraciously, devouring books far beyond her age level. She asked questions constantly about history, about science, about the way the world worked, and Marguerite answered every one. But it was not merely academic. Slowly, carefully, the two of them began to build something that looked almost like family. Marguerite was careful to maintain appropriate boundaries. She was, after all, still an employee. But in the quiet moments, when Phoebe curled up beside her on the schoolroom sofa, reading aloud from a book of myths, when the child reached for her hand during a thunderstorm, when she caught Phoebe watching her with an expression of such naked need that it made her heart ache, she allowed herself to love this fierce, wounded, brilliant girl, and Phoebe, she suspected, allowed herself to be loved. Part 4. The First Glimpse. Marguerite saw the Duke rarely during those first months. He was a distant presence, a shadow glimpsed at the end of corridors, a voice heard through closed doors, a name spoken with reverence or fear by the household staff. But she saw him once. It was late evening, long past the hour when she should have been in her room. She had been in the library, the Duke's library, a vast, magnificent space that contained more books than she had ever seen in one place, searching for a volume of Greek poetry she had promised Phoebe. She had thought she was alone. She was wrong. He was standing by the fire, one arm resting on the mantelpiece, a glass of brandy in his hand. The flames cast shadows across his face, emphasizing the sharp planes of his cheekbones, the stern line of his mouth. He was not wearing his coat or cravat. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, and his dark hair was disheveled, as if he had been running his fingers through it. He looked tired. He looked human. He looked, for just that moment, almost vulnerable. And then he saw her. Miss Holloway. His voice was ice. The vulnerability vanished as if it had never existed, replaced by the cold mask she had heard described so many times. You are in my library. I apologize, Your Grace. She clutched the book to her chest, suddenly aware of how inappropriate this was. A governess alone with the master of the house, late at night, in a dimly lit room. I was looking for a book for Phoebe. I did not realize you were. The servants use the servants' library. He had not moved, had not raised his voice, but his displeasure was palpable. This room is for members of the household. The word struck like a slap. Members of the household. Not her. Never her. Of course, Your Grace. Forgive me. It will not happen again. She turned to leave. Wait. She stopped, did not turn. What book were you seeking? She hesitated. The Odyssey, Your Grace. Phoebe has been studying Greek, and I promised her we would read Homer. A long pause. Then, almost reluctantly, third shelf from the left. Top row. The Chapman translation is adequate, but if she's able, the Buckley is superior. She turned then, surprised despite herself. You've read both? Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that she would question him. Or perhaps something else entirely. I studied classics at Cambridge, Miss Holloway, before I inherited the title and was required to dedicate my life to more practical matters. He raised the brandy glass to his lips. It seems we have something in common." And then, before she could respond, before she could do something foolish, like ask him what other books he had loved, what other dreams he had abandoned, he turned away, dismissing her. "Good night, Miss Holloway. Do try not to wander into rooms where you don't belong in the future." She fled. But that night, lying in her narrow bed, she could not stop thinking about the way the firelight had played across his features. The unexpected knowledge of Greek translations. The flicker of something. Loneliness, she thought, though she couldn't be sure. That she had glimpsed before his mask had fallen back into place. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself he was cold and cruel, and so far above her that he might as well have been a distant star. She told herself she did not lie awake thinking about him. She lied. 1. Part 5. The Investigation. The investigation into the Whitmore Railway Company took 3 weeks. 3 weeks during which Marguerite continued her duties as if nothing had happened, teaching Phoebe mathematics and French and the proper way to enter a drawing room. 3 weeks during which she caught glimpses of the Duke striding through the corridors, always in motion, always with a stack of papers in his hand, or a servant hurrying behind him with urgent messages. 3 weeks during which she told herself that her intervention had been a moment of temporary madness, that she would never speak to the Duke again, that she would return to her invisible existence and be grateful for it. But something had changed. She caught him watching her. At dinner, she ate in the servants' hall, of course, but occasionally she saw him pass through the corridors nearby. His eyes would find hers for just a moment before looking away. In the schoolroom, where he sometimes appeared to check on Phoebe's progress, his gaze would linger on her face longer than necessary. In the library, she had stopped going there, but once, retrieving a book for Phoebe from the servants' collection, she had looked up to find him standing in the doorway, watching her with an expression she could not read. Each time, her heart would race. Each time, she would look away first, reminding herself of her place. And each time, she would feel his eyes on her back as she walked away. On the 21st day, a footman appeared in the schoolroom with a summons. His Grace requested Miss Holloway's presence in his study at her earliest convenience. Earliest convenience, in a Duke's vocabulary, meant immediately. So Marguerite set aside Phoebe's geography lesson, smoothed her gray skirts with hands that trembled only slightly, and made her way to the ground floor. The study door was open. Julian stood by the window, silhouetted against the gray November light. His desk was covered in documents, letters, and what appeared to be legal proceedings. "You were right," he said without preamble, turning to face her. "About all of it." Marguerite's breath caught. The railway company. A fraud. The engineering surveys were fabricated. The route they claimed to be building doesn't exist. The land they described is actually a marsh that would swallow any train track within a year. Pemberton's involvement was deliberate. Whitmore hired him specifically because he knew how to make false documentation look convincing. Julian's jaw tightened. They have been running this scheme for 3 years. By my investigator's estimate, they have defrauded investors of over £300,000. Families have been ruined, fortunes destroyed. One man, a minor baron who invested his entire estate, took his own life last year when he discovered the truth. He left behind a widow and 4 children. The youngest was 3 years old. Marguerite closed her eyes briefly. She had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed, hearing about the baron, the children, was still a blow. "What will happen to them?" she asked quietly. "Whitmore was arrested yesterday. He resisted, tried to flee to the continent with his mistress and a suitcase full of cash, but my men caught him at Dover." Julian's smile was cold. "He is currently in Newgate awaiting trial. Pemberton fled earlier, but I have people looking for him. He won't hide for long." "And Lord Reginald Fairfax?" Julian raised an eyebrow. "You know about Fairfax?" "I know that his name appeared in several of the documents as a recommending party. And I know that he has a reputation for introducing wealthy marks to questionable investment opportunities in exchange for a percentage of the take." She met his eyes steadily. "My father may have been a scholar, Your Grace, but he taught me to read between the lines." Something flickered in Julian's expression. Surprise, respect, perhaps even amusement. Fairfax has been quietly informed that if he does not leave England permanently, certain information about his gambling debts, his mistresses, and his involvement in this scheme will find its way to the newspapers and to Parliament. He departed for Australia this morning. Australia seems insufficient punishment for destroying lives. Perhaps. But his family is ancient and well-connected, and a public trial would drag on for years and accomplish little. Sometimes the threat of destruction is more effective than destruction itself. Julian moved to his desk and picked up an envelope. "Which brings me to you, Miss Holloway." Her heart began to pound. "I told you that if your information proved correct, you would be rewarded." He held out the envelope. "This is a bank draft for £500, as well as a letter of recommendation that should secure you a position in any household in England." £500. Marguerite stared at the envelope. It was more money than she had ever possessed in her life. It was freedom, years of security, the ability to live independently, perhaps even to travel or to continue her own studies. It was everything she had dreamed of during those dark months after her father's death. She did not reach for it. "You're refusing?" Julian's eyebrows rose. "I am hesitating, Your Grace." "Why?" "Because if I take this money and leave, I will never see you again. Because in these 3 weeks, you have become the most interesting person I have ever met, and I am not ready for that to be over. Because when you look at me, really look at me, the way you're looking at me now, I feel like I exist again." She could not say any of that. "Because I don't wish to leave Phoebe," she said instead. It was true, if not the complete truth. "She has made remarkable progress in the past months. She trusts me. To abandon her now would be cruel." Julian was silent for a long moment, studying her face with those winter-gray eyes that seemed to see everything. "You care for her," he said finally. It was not a question. "I do, Your Grace." "Why?" "She is not your child. She is not your family. She is merely your charge, a duty you perform in exchange for wages." Marguerite thought of Phoebe curled beside her on the schoolroom sofa, of the child's hand reaching for hers during a thunderstorm, of the way Phoebe's face lit up when she solved a difficult problem. "Because she reminds me of myself," she said quietly. "A child who lost everything, who was told to be invisible, to ask nothing, to expect nothing, who was brilliant and fierce, and so desperately lonely that she lashed out at everyone who came close." She met his eyes. "I cannot give her back what she lost, but I can show her that she is not alone, that someone sees her, that her mind, her beautiful, extraordinary mind, is worthy of cultivation and care." Julian said nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy with something Marguerite could not name. Then, slowly, he set down the envelope. "I have a different proposition," he said. "One that would allow you to remain with Phoebe, while also putting your unique talents to better use." Part 6. The Arrangement. Zin. "A secretary," Marguerite repeated slowly. "My private secretary," Julian clarified. "You would continue to oversee Phoebe's education. She does well with you, and I will not disrupt that. But you would also assist me with correspondence, research, and analysis. Your salary would be tripled. You would have access to my library without restriction. It is highly unusual. A woman serving as a duke's private secretary. Society would talk. Society always talks. I have never particularly cared. And the other servants? They would see it as favoritism. There would be resentment. Then they would learn to manage their resentment, or they would find employment elsewhere. Julian's voice was flat, final. I do not make decisions based on the opinions of people who lack the vision to understand them. She should say no. Every instinct of self-preservation told her to take the money, take the letter of recommendation, and flee before this man, this dangerous, compelling, impossible man, turned her carefully ordered life upside down any further. Yes, she said, I accept. The months that followed were unlike anything Marguerite had ever experienced. The work began formally enough. She was given a small desk in the anteroom adjoining Julian's study, close enough to be summoned at a moment's notice, far enough to maintain the appearance of propriety. The arrangement made sense from a practical standpoint. From every other standpoint, it was torture. Every day, she sat mere feet from the door behind which Julian worked. She heard his voice through the walls, giving orders, negotiating with visitors, occasionally laughing at something one of his associates said. She learned the rhythm of his days, the morning correspondence, the afternoon meetings, the late evening hours when he worked alone with only a glass of brandy for company. And every day, at least once, he called for her. Miss Holloway, a moment. She would enter his study and find him at his desk, papers spread before him, his brow furrowed in concentration. He never looked up immediately. He would finish whatever sentence he was writing, set down his pen with deliberate care, and only then raise those winter-gray eyes to meet hers. In those moments, those brief, electrically charged moments before he spoke, Marguerite felt as though all the air had been pulled from the room. This contract, he would say, or this letter, or this proposal. Always business. Always proper. Always the careful distance of employer and employee. But sometimes, when she leaned over his desk to point out a discrepancy or suggest an alternative approach, she would feel the heat of his body beside her. She would catch the scent of his cologne, sandalwood, and something darker, something that made her pulse quicken. And occasionally, just occasionally, his hand would brush against hers as they both reached for the same document. He never apologized for these touches. Neither did she. You're staring, Phoebe observed one afternoon during their French lesson. You've been staring a lot lately. It's strange. Is it strange to think? It is when you're thinking about His Grace. Phoebe's eyes were far too knowing for a 9-year-old. You get this look on your face, all soft and distant, like you're somewhere else entirely. I'm sure I don't know what you mean. You do. And he does too, you know. Gets the same look when he thinks no one's watching. Phoebe tilted her head. Do you like His Grace, Miss Holloway? He is my employer, Phoebe. It would not be appropriate. That's not what I asked. I asked if you like him. Marguerite looked at this child, this fierce, intelligent, lonely child who had lost everything and was slowly, carefully, learning to trust again, and found she could not lie. Yes, she said softly. I like him very much. Good. Phoebe nodded, satisfied. He likes you too. He talks about you at dinner. Miss Holloway thinks this. Miss Holloway observed that. It's actually quite annoying, but she was smiling as she said it. He's different since you came. Less cold. More human. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Marguerite acknowledged the truth she had been avoiding. She was falling in love with Julian Vance. It was impossible. It was inappropriate. It was the kind of hopeless, destructive feeling that ruined women like her. women without fortune or connections, women who existed at the mercy of their employer's goodwill. She had seen what happened to governesses who fell in love with the masters of the house. They were dismissed in disgrace, cast out without references, left to slide into poverty or worse. And yet, when he said her name, Miss Holloway, something in his voice made her believe he was thinking Marguerite. And yet when their eyes met across his study, she could swear she saw the same longing in his gaze that burned in her chest. And yet, when he laughed at one of her observations, that rare, surprised sound, like he had forgotten laughter existed, she felt as though she had been given a gift more precious than gold. She should leave. She should take the money he had offered. It was still waiting for her. He had made that clear. And find another position far from London, far from temptation, far from the gray eyes that seemed to see straight through her. But she could not make herself go. One evening, working late on a particularly complex contract analysis, she fell asleep at her desk. She woke to the sensation of warmth, a blanket being draped over her shoulders, and the faint scent of sandalwood. She kept her eyes closed, her breathing steady, feigning sleep. Marguerite. His voice was barely a whisper, so soft she might have imagined it. His hand hovered near her hair. She could feel the warmth of it, though he did not touch her. What am I going to do about you? She did not move, did not breathe. A long moment passed. Then she heard his footsteps retreating, the soft click of the door closing behind him. And in the silence of the empty anteroom, Marguerite pressed her hand to her racing heart and wondered if perhaps, she was not the only one who was falling. She had expected the work to be demanding, and it was. Julian's business interests were vast, his correspondence endless, his standards impossibly high. But she had also expected it to be cold, transactional, the efficient cooperation of two minds working toward practical ends. She had not expected the conversations. They began with business, discussions of railway investments and shipping contracts, of market fluctuations and parliamentary regulations. But they did not stay there. Julian, she discovered, had a mind as restless and hungry as her own. He asked her opinions on matters far beyond finance, on political philosophy, on the novels of Mr. Dickens, on the recent discoveries in geology that were challenging traditional understandings of the Earth's age. He disagreed with her frequently and respected her more for defending her positions. He recommended books and was visibly pleased when she read them and argued with his interpretations. For the first time since her father's death, Marguerite felt intellectually alive. But it was more than that. There were moments, small, fleeting moments that she collected like precious stones, when the ice in Julian's eyes would thaw, when she would say something unexpected and catch the ghost of a smile on his lips, when their hands would brush over a document and he would not pull away immediately, when she would look up from her work to find him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself he was her employer. She told herself she wasn't falling in love with him. She lied. Part 7. The Humiliation. It happened at Lady Pemberton's Christmas ball. Julian had been obligated to attend, some matter of political necessity, Marguerite gathered from the correspondence she managed. She had not expected to be included. Governesses and secretaries did not attend balls, but Phoebe had begged. The child had never been to a ball, had never seen the glittering world that awaited her as the Duke's ward, and Julian, in an uncharacteristic moment of softness, had agreed. "You will accompany her," he had told Marguerite. "She trusts you, and I will need you there to manage correspondence that may arise." So Marguerite had found herself standing at the edge of a ballroom in a borrowed gown. One of the housekeeper's nieces had married above her station and had left behind several evening dresses. Watching Phoebe's face light up at the chandeliers, the orchestra, the swirling couples on the dance floor. "It's beautiful," Phoebe breathed. "Miss Holloway, isn't it beautiful?" "It is," Marguerite agreed, though her eyes had found Julian across the room, resplendent in evening clothes, surrounded by admirers. One admirer in particular. Lady Arabella Thornton was everything Marguerite was not. Beautiful, wealthy, well-born, and clearly determined to become the next Duchess of Ashworth. She had positioned herself at Julian's side with the strategic precision of a military campaign, her hand resting on his arm, her laugh tinkling like bells whenever he spoke. And Julian was smiling at her. It was a small smile, polite rather than genuine, but it was more than Marguerite had ever seen him give to anyone in public. Her chest tightened with something ugly and familiar, something she had no right to feel. She looked away. "Miss Holloway," the voice came from behind her. She turned to find a woman she did not recognize, middle-aged, elaborately dressed, with the sharp, assessing eyes of a society matron. "I am Mrs. Holloway's daughter," Marguerite said carefully. "Miss Marguerite Holloway." "Yes, I know precisely who you are." The woman's smile was cold. The governess who has somehow wormed her way into the Duke of Ashworth's household. "There has been quite a bit of talk about you, my dear." Marguerite felt ice form in her stomach. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "Don't you? The servants talk, Miss Holloway. They always do. And the talk about you is most interesting." The woman stepped closer, her voice dropping to a carrying whisper that nonetheless seemed designed to reach the ears of nearby guests. "The daughter of a disgraced Cambridge professor, I'm told. A man who died in debt, leaving his daughter to fend for herself. And now here you are, somehow serving as the Duke's private secretary, attending balls, wearing borrowed gowns." Marguerite's face burned. "My father was not disgraced." "Oh, but he was, my dear. Did you think no one remembered? The scandal with the research funding? The accusations of falsified data?" The woman's smile widened. "Of course, nothing was ever proven. But then, he died, before the investigation could be completed. Most convenient, don't you think?" The world tilted. Falsified data, accusations, investigation. None of it was true. Her father had been the most honest man she had ever known. But she had heard whispers after his death. Whispers she had ignored. Had dismissed as the jealousy of lesser scholars. Whispers that, apparently, had followed her here. "That is a lie," she said, but her voice came out thin, trembling. "Is it? How would you know, dear girl? You were hardly privy to your father's professional affairs." The woman turned to address the small crowd that had gathered, drawn by the scent of scandal. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Miss Marguerite Holloway, the daughter of a fraud, and quite possibly following in his footsteps. One has to wonder what services she is providing the Duke to earn such an elevated position in his household." Someone gasped. Someone else laughed. And Marguerite stood frozen, her face burning with humiliation, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to do anything but stand there as her reputation, her father's reputation, was torn to shreds in front of London's elite. "Enough!" The single word cut through the murmurs like a blade. Julian Vance stood at the edge of the crowd, his face carved from ice, his eyes burning with a cold fury that made even the society matron take a step back. "Your Grace," the woman began, "you were merely slandering a woman under my protection with lies and innuendo." Julian's voice was soft, but it carried across the suddenly silent ballroom. Professor Leonard Holloway was one of the most respected mathematicians of his generation. The accusations against him were fabricated by competitors who envied his success, and they were thoroughly disproven after his death. Anyone with access to Cambridge records could verify this within an hour. He stepped forward, and the crowd parted before him like the Red Sea before Moses. Furthermore, Mrs. Cathcart, I find it fascinating that you would question Miss Holloway's character when your own son is currently facing accusations of embezzlement from his father-in-law's firm. Glass houses, I believe the expression goes. Mrs. Cathcart went white. Miss Holloway is my employee, Julian continued, his voice rising to carry across the room. She is also the finest secretary I have ever had, possessed of a mind that puts most Oxford scholars to shame. Any suggestion of impropriety is not only false, but actionable. And anyone, his gaze swept the assembled guests, anyone who spread such rumors will answer to me personally. The silence was absolute. Then Julian turned to Marguerite and offered his arm. Miss Holloway, I believe you promised to help Phoebe find the refreshment table. Allow me to escort you. She took his arm because she could not do anything else. Her legs moved mechanically, carrying her through the parted crowd, past the staring faces, toward the far end of the ballroom, where Phoebe stood watching with wide, frightened eyes. They did not speak until they reached the terrace, where the cold night air hit Marguerite's burning face like a blessing. Breathe, Julian said quietly. She tried, failed, tried again. The sobs came, anyway. Great, wrenching sobs that she could not control, could not stop, could not hide. I'm sorry, she choked out. I'm so sorry. I should not have come. I should have known that someone would remember, that they would use my father against me. Stop! His voice was sharp, but his hands, when he reached out and gripped her shoulders, were gentle. You have nothing to apologize for. Nothing. But Mrs. Cathcart is a vicious, small-minded woman who has made a career of destroying anyone who threatens her social position. You threaten her because you are intelligent and capable, and everything she will never be. She saw you standing there in your borrowed gown, and she recognized something that terrified her. What? What could I possibly threaten? The truth. Julian's grip on her shoulders tightened. The truth that breeding and money do not make a person worthy. That a woman in a 5-year-old gown can be worth more than all the diamonds in that ballroom. That her son, for all his expensive education, will never have half the mind you possess. She said, my father. Lies. All of it lies. Julian released her shoulders, but did not step back. Your father was a great man, Marguerite. I know, because I looked into his work after you told me about him. I spent 3 days reading every paper he published, every article written about him, every piece of correspondence I could find. His contributions to applied mathematics were substantial. The accusations against him were manufactured by a rival scholar named Edmund Shaw, who was later censured by the Royal Society for academic misconduct. Your father's reputation was restored posthumously. The investigation cleared his name completely. You researched my father? Of course I did. He said it as though it were obvious, as though spending 3 days investigating the life of a dead professor were the most natural thing in the world. You work for me. Your character reflects on my household. It was only prudent to verify your claims. Prudent. The word tasted bitter. Of course. Prudent. That's not... He broke off, frustration flickering across his features. I'm saying this badly. I always say things badly when it matters. When what matters? He did not answer. Instead, he stood there, looking at her, with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Something raw, something almost vulnerable. something that made her heart hammer against her ribs. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you defend me in front of everyone? Why would you destroy your relationship with half of London society for a governess, for a secretary, for someone who doesn't matter? You matter." The words seemed to be pulled from him against his will. "You matter more than you know. More than I want you to. More than I have ever allowed anyone to matter." "Julian, don't," his voice cracked. "Don't call me that unless you mean it. Unless you understand what it does to me when you say my name. Unless you know that I have spent 6 months trying to convince myself that what I feel for you is merely respect, merely admiration, merely the appreciation of one intelligent mind for another." Her heart stopped. "And," she whispered, "and I have failed." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the rapid pulse at his throat, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body cutting through the cold night air. "I have failed utterly and completely. I am not made of ice, as it turns out. I am made of something far more dangerous, and you have set it on fire." Marguerite could not breathe, could not think, could only stand there as everything she had wanted and feared crashed over her like a wave. "I know this is impossible," he continued, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "I know what society would say. I know the distance between us. A duke and a governess. God, the gossips would feast for years. No, I should send you away, should make you take that money and that letter and forget you ever knew me." His hand rose, trembling slightly to touch her cheek. "But I cannot. God help me, Marguerite. I cannot let you go." "Then don't." The words escaped before she could stop them, before propriety or sense or self-preservation could intervene. "Don't let me go. If I keep you," he said, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone, "I will keep you completely. Not as a secretary, not as a governess. As my wife." The world stopped. "Julian, I know you need time. I know this is sudden and overwhelming and terrifying. Believe me, I am terrified myself. But I have never been more certain of anything in my life." His forehead touched hers. "You saved me, Marguerite. Not just from Whitmore's scheme, from myself. From the cold, hollow existence I had convinced myself was all I deserved. You looked at me and saw someone worth saving. Someone capable of more than ice and calculation and control. I saw you," she whispered. "I've always seen you. Then see this, too." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "I love you. I love your mind, and your courage, and your stubborn, magnificent refusal to be invisible. I love the way you argue with me, and the way you make Phoebe laugh, and the way you look at books like they're old friends you've been waiting to see again. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that you deserve to be loved in return." Marguerite closed her eyes. She thought of her father, who had loved her absolutely and lost her everything. She thought of her mother, who had died before she could remember her. She thought of all the years she had spent invisible, overlooked, forgotten, and of this man, this impossible, infuriating, extraordinary man who had looked at her and seen someone worth seeing. "Yes," she said. Julian pulled back slightly, his eyes searching her face. "Yes? Yes, I will marry you. Yes, I love you. Yes to all of it. The scandal and the gossip and the society matrons who will faint at the idea of a governess becoming a duchess." She was crying now, she realized, tears streaming down her face. But she was also laughing. "Yes, Julian. 1,000 times. Yes." He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the polite, restrained kisses she had imagined during her loneliest nights. It was fire and desperation and promise all at once, The kind of kiss that rewrote the rules of the universe, that demolished every wall and burned every bridge, and left nothing but two people clinging to each other in the wreckage. When they finally broke apart, Julian was smiling. A real smile, full and unguarded. The smile of a man who had just discovered that the ice around his heart had melted and found an ocean underneath. "We should tell Phoebe," Marguerite said, her voice still unsteady. "She'll be unbearable. She's been predicting this for months. She's a perceptive child. I should have known she would see what I was too blind to admit. She told me you talk about me at dinner. Apparently, it's quite annoying." Julian laughed. That same startled sound she had heard in his study months ago, but freer now, lighter. "I shall have to find new dinner conversation topics then, though I suspect I shall fail utterly." He took her hand, raised it to his lips, and kissed her knuckles with a tenderness that made her heart crack open. "Come," he said. "Let us go back inside and give London something to really talk about." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I am going to dance with you, in front of everyone, and then I am going to announce our engagement and watch Mrs. Cathcart's face turn the most satisfying shade of purple." His smile turned wicked. "Consider it part of my revenge. I thought you didn't care about society." "I don't. But I very much care about you. And I want every person in that ballroom to know that Marguerite Holloway is the future Duchess of Ashworth, and that anyone who disrespects her will answer to me." He led her back toward the ballroom, and Marguerite went willingly, her hand in his, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Behind them, the winter roses rustled in the cold wind, and somewhere in the garden, a nightingale began to sing. Pon. Chabaito. The Revenge. The trial of Silas Whitmore was the sensation of the season. Marguerite sat in the gallery beside Julian, her hand clasped in his, and watched as the man who had stolen £300,000 from innocent families was finally brought to account. Whitmore had aged a decade in the months since his arrest. His fine clothes hung on a gaunt frame. His eyes, once confident and calculating, darted around the courtroom with the desperation of a trapped animal. He had hired the best barristers money could buy, but it had not been enough. Julian had made sure it would not be enough. Every piece of fabricated evidence had been traced and documented. Every forged signature had been exposed. Every victim had been found and given the opportunity to testify. The Baron's widow had taken the stand, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face, and described how she had found her husband's body, how she had explained to her children that their father was gone, how she had sold everything she owned just to keep food on the table. "He took everything from us," she said, looking directly at Whitmore. "Not just our money, our security, our future. My husband's life." Whitmore had not met her eyes. The verdict was guilty on all counts. The sentence, transportation to Australia for life. As the guards led Whitmore from the courtroom, Julian stood and walked to the barrier separating the gallery from the floor. "Whitmore." The convicted man turned, his face a mask of hatred and fear. "You thought you could steal from me," Julian said quietly, his voice carrying in the hushed courtroom. "You thought I was just another mark, another wealthy fool who would sign whatever papers you put in front of him. But you made a mistake." He leaned forward, his gray eyes cold as winter. "You underestimated the people around me. You underestimated a woman you would have dismissed as beneath your notice. And now you will spend the rest of your life in a penal colony while she becomes a duchess." Whitmore's face twisted. "You think you've won? You think this is over? There are others. There were others. They have been dealt with." Julian's smile was the most terrifying thing Marguerite had ever seen. Every associate, every collaborator, every person who profited from your scheme. Some are in prison. Some have fled the country. Some have lost everything they stole, and more besides. Your network is destroyed, Whitmore, and your name will be remembered only as a cautionary tale about what happens to those who try to deceive the Duke of Ashworth. He turned away, offering his arm to Marguerite. Come, my love, we have a wedding to plan. They walked out of the courtroom together, leaving Silas Whitmore to face the consequences of his crimes alone. Purduanan tuart dior the wedding. The wedding of Julian Vance, Duke of Ashworth, to Miss Marguerite Holloway took place on a brilliant June morning in the chapel at Ashworth Park, the Duke's country estate. Society had talked, of course. Society always talked. The gossip columns had been relentless. The governess who had somehow entrapped one of England's most eligible bachelors, the gold digger, the fortune hunter, the schemer. Mrs. Cathcart had attempted to circulate further rumors until a quiet word from Julian's solicitors about libel laws had silenced her permanently. But on this day, none of that mattered. The chapel was filled with flowers, white roses and lily of the valley, their scent perfuming the air. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting patterns of colored light across the stone floor. The pews were filled with guests. Not many, for Julian had insisted on a small wedding, but those present were genuine friends and family. Phoebe stood at the altar as flower girl, her copper hair adorned with a crown of white roses, her face glowing with happiness. And Marguerite walked down the aisle alone. She had no father to give her away, no family to stand beside her. But as she walked toward Julian, she realized she did not need anyone to give her away. She was giving herself, freely, willingly, joyfully, to the man who had seen her when the world had tried to make her invisible. Julian stood at the altar, and when she reached him, he took her hands in his. "You're trembling," he murmured. "I'm happy," she whispered back. He smiled, a real smile, the smile she had worked so hard to earn, and she felt tears prick her eyes. The ceremony was traditional, the vows spoken solemnly before God and these witnesses. But when the vicar asked if anyone objected to this union, Julian turned to face the congregation with an expression that dared anyone to speak. No one did. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the vicar declared. "You may kiss the bride." Julian cupped her face in his hands, the same gesture he had made on the terrace, the night everything changed, and kissed her with all the tenderness and passion that lived beneath his icy exterior. The congregation applauded. Phoebe cheered loudly enough to make several elderly guests wince, and Marguerite, for the first time in years, felt completely and perfectly at home. Part 10. The Truth. Sontam. That night, in the master bedroom of Ashworth Park, Marguerite lay in her husband's arms and finally told him the whole truth. "I need you to know something," she said quietly, "about why I really spoke up that day, about the contract. You saw the error. You couldn't stay silent." "Yes, but that's not all of it." She propped herself up to look at him. "I knew who you were, not just your title, your reputation. The servants talked about your business dealings, about what you did to people who crossed you. I knew that if I was wrong, you would destroy me. And if I was right, I knew what you would do to Whitmore." Julian was silent, his gray eyes intent on her face. "I was counting on it," she continued. "I wanted him to face justice. My father spent his final years trying to expose men like Pemberton, fraudsters who preyed on the vulnerable, who used false credentials to steal fortunes from people who trusted them. He filed complaints, wrote letters, petitioned the Royal Society for investigations. And nothing happened, because men like that are protected by men with money and power who benefit from looking the other way. She took a breath. When I saw Pemberton's name on those documents, I knew exactly what the Whitmore Railway Company was. I knew that the only person with enough power to destroy them was you. So I used you. She met his eyes. I told myself I was being noble, saving you from fraud, seeking justice for victims. But the truth is, I wanted revenge. I wanted to see Pemberton and Whitmore suffer the way my father suffered, when no one would listen to him. I wanted to be the one who finally made someone pay. Julian was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her face. Do you know what I thought? That day in my study, when you stood there in your gray dress and told me I was about to be swindled. I imagine you thought I was impertinent. I thought you were the bravest person I had ever met. His thumb traced her cheekbone. I thought, here is a woman with nothing, no money, no status, no protection, and she is risking everything to tell me the truth. Not because she owes me anything, but because it is right. And I thought, I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who would never do that. People who tell me what I want to hear because they want something from me. People who would watch me sign away a fortune rather than risk my displeasure by speaking up. He pulled her down and kissed her forehead. You used me to get justice for your father. I would have done the same thing in your position. The difference is that I have the power to follow through, and you gave me the opportunity to use it. He paused. We are a matched set, Marguerite. Both of us too stubborn to stay silent, too proud to accept injustice, too broken in our own ways to believe we deserved love. And yet, here we are. Here we are, she echoed. I am not sorry that you used me. I am only sorry that you ever had to. He pulled her closer, wrapping around her like he could shield her from every hurt she had ever suffered. You will never have to use anyone again. You will never have to be invisible again. Whatever you want, whatever you need, it is yours. I swear it. Marguerite closed her eyes and let herself believe him. Part 11. The Almost Loss. 2 years into their marriage, Marguerite nearly died. It happened in childbirth, that most common of tragedies, the danger that lurked beneath every pregnancy in an age before modern medicine. She had carried the child easily enough, had glowed with health throughout the pregnancy, had felt no premonition of what was to come. Now, I need to pause here and explain something important about childbirth in Victorian England. We sometimes forget, in our modern world of hospitals and medical interventions, how dangerous this most natural of processes once was. Maternal mortality rates were staggeringly high. Some estimates suggest that 1 in every 100 births resulted in the mother's death, and many more left women weakened or injured for the rest of their lives. Every woman who became pregnant knew, in some corner of her mind, that she might not survive. It was the shadow that hung over every nursery, every layette, every hopeful conversation about names and futures. Marguerite knew the risks. She had accepted them willingly, eagerly, desperate to give Julian the heir he needed and the family they both wanted. But accepting a risk intellectually is very different from facing it when it arrives. But the labor was long, too long, and when the bleeding started, it would not stop. Julian had been pacing outside the bedroom door. It was not customary for husbands to be present at births, but he had refused to leave the corridor, had snapped at every servant who suggested he wait elsewhere. Mrs. Drummond, who had known him since he was a boy, had never seen him so undone. Your Grace, please, she urged. The Duchess is strong. The doctor is skilled. You must try to calm yourself. "I cannot be calm," Julian said, and his voice, that voice that was always so controlled, so cold, so careful, cracked like ice in spring. "I cannot be calm when she is in there, suffering, and I can do nothing to help her." Hours passed. The sun set. The sounds from behind the closed door grew more urgent, more desperate. And then, terribly, they stopped. Julian froze mid-pace. The silence was worse than the screaming, so much worse. He lunged for the door, but before he could reach it, it opened, and the doctor emerged. There was blood on his hands. "The baby is alive," the doctor said quickly. "A girl. Healthy and strong." Julian could not process the words. He was staring at the blood, so much blood, and remembering another night, another door, another doctor emerging with that same look on his face. He had been 8 years old when his mother died. She had been giving birth to what would have been his younger sibling, a brother or sister he would never know. The labor had been difficult, and she had bled, and the doctors had been unable to stop it. And Julian had stood in a corridor much like this one, waiting, praying to a God he wasn't sure existed, until his father had emerged with a face like stone and said, "She's gone." He had not cried. His father had not permitted crying. Vances did not show weakness, did not show emotion, did not show anything that could be used against them. Julian had learned that lesson well. He had locked his grief away in a box inside his chest and had never opened it again. But now, "The Duchess," he heard himself say. "Marguerite, is she?" "She has lost a great deal of blood." The doctor's face was grave. "We have done what we can, but I must be honest with you, Your Grace. The next few hours will be critical. She is very weak." Julian pushed past him into the room. Marguerite lay on the bed, pale as death, her eyes closed. A nurse held a small, wrapped bundle, the baby, his daughter. But Julian could not look at her. He could only look at his wife, at the woman who had destroyed his walls and rebuilt his heart, lying so still that for one terrible moment he thought she was already gone. He fell to his knees beside the bed and took her hand. "Marguerite," his voice cracked. "Marguerite, please." No response. The box inside his chest, the one where he had locked all his grief, all his fear, all his love, shattered. "You cannot leave me." Tears were streaming down his face. Tears he had not shed since childhood. Tears he had convinced himself he was incapable of producing. "You cannot. I will not allow it. I have spent my entire life alone, and you made me believe I deserved more than that. You cannot show me what love is and then take it away. It is not fair. It is not right." Her hand was cold in his. He pressed his forehead to her hand, his shoulders shaking with sobs. "I never told you," he choked out, "about my mother, about what happened to her. She died like this, in childbirth, bleeding, while I stood outside and prayed and promised God I would be good, I would be perfect, I would never cause trouble again, if he would just let her live. And he didn't. He took her anyway. And I have spent the rest of my life punishing myself for it, for being born, for being the child she lived to raise, while the other one, the one she died for, never drew a single breath." His whole body was trembling now. "I thought if I never loved anyone, I could never lose anyone. I thought if I kept everyone at a distance, death could not touch me again. And then you walked into my study in your gray dress and your sharp mind and your absolute refusal to be invisible, and you ruined everything. You made me love you. You made me need you. Please," he whispered, "I love you. I've never said it enough. I know that now. I've been too proud, too afraid, too convinced that saying the words would make me vulnerable. But I love you, Marguerite. I love your mind, and your courage, and your stubborn, magnificent refusal to be invisible. I love the way you argue with me, and the way you make Phoebe laugh, and the way you look at our daughter, Marguerite. We have a daughter, with such wonder. Please, please don't leave me. For a long moment, nothing. Then, so faintly he almost missed it, her fingers tightened around his. Julian, her voice was barely a whisper. Stop. Crying. It's undignified. He laughed, a broken, sobbing laugh, and pressed his forehead to her hand. Don't ever do that to me again, he said fiercely. I forbid it. You can't forbid me. Anything. But she was smiling, weakly, her eyes fluttering open. The baby? Alive, healthy, beautiful. He turned to the nurse, who brought the wrapped bundle close. She has your eyes. Marguerite looked at her daughter for the first time, and Julian watched her face transform with a love so fierce and tender that it took his breath away. Eleanor, she whispered, for my mother, and Margaret, for yours. Julian felt fresh tears spill down his cheeks. You remembered. I told you her name once. You remembered. Of course I did. I remember everything you tell me. Eleanor Margaret Vance. Julian reached out to touch his daughter's tiny hand. She's perfect. She is. Marguerite looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears. We made something perfect, Julian. We made a family. We did. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. And now, you need to rest, so you can be there to watch her grow up. We have so much time ahead of us, my love. So many years. I need you there for all of them. I'll try, she whispered. I promise I'll try. She did more than try. She survived. She recovered. And 3 months later, she was strong enough to hold her daughter in her arms and walk through the gardens of Ashworth Park, Julian at her side, and believed that happiness was not a fleeting thing, but a life she had earned and deserved. But Julian never forgot those hours of terror. He never forgot the moment when he thought he had lost her. And every day, for the rest of their lives together, he told her he loved her. Out loud, without reservation, without the cold armor he had worn for so many years. Some lessons, after all, are learned only at the edge of loss. Part 12. The Legacy. "5 years after the wedding, the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth sat in the garden and watched their children play. Eleanor, now 4, was teaching her younger brother Marcus, 2 years old and already showing signs of his mother's stubbornness, how to catch butterflies. Phoebe, now 12 and growing into a remarkable young woman, supervised them both with the long-suffering patience of an older sister. "She'll need a season soon," Marguerite observed. "Phoebe, she'll be old enough in a few years." "She'll take society by storm," Julian replied. "God help any man foolish enough to pursue her. She'll eat him alive." "She learned from the best." Marguerite leaned her head against his shoulder. "Though I hope she finds someone who sees her, really sees her, the way you saw me." Julian was quiet for a moment, watching the children. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Giving up your freedom. You could have taken the money. You could have traveled, studied, done anything you wanted. Instead, you tied yourself to a cold, difficult man and a household full of responsibilities." Marguerite turned to look at him. "You're not cold anymore. I still have my moments. Everyone has moments." She reached up and touched his face, the face she had loved for 5 years now, the face she would love until she died. "I never wanted freedom, Julian. I wanted purpose. I wanted a family. I wanted to be seen. And now? Now I have everything I ever dreamed of, and things I never knew to dream of. She smiled. A husband who challenges me, children who fill my heart, a stepdaughter who has become a true daughter in every way that matters, work that uses my mind, a life that means something. You saved me, Julian said quietly. You know that, don't you? Not just from Whitmore, from myself, from the cold, lonely existence I had convinced myself was all I deserved. We saved each other. She kissed his cheek. That's what love is, isn't it? Two people choosing each other, over and over, every day. Two people building something together that neither could build alone. You should write that down. It's quite profound. I learned from a brilliant man. She grinned, even if he is occasionally cold and difficult. Julian laughed, that surprised, delighted sound that still made her heart flutter after all these years, and pulled her close. I love you, he said. Have I mentioned that today? Only 3 times. You're slipping. I love you, he repeated. I love you. I love you. There. That should hold until dinner. From across the garden, Eleanor looked up and saw her parents embracing. She tugged on Phoebe's sleeve. Why do Mom and Papa always do that? She asked. Phoebe smiled. Because they're happy, Ellie. Oh. Eleanor considered this. I want to be that happy when I grow up. Then find someone who sees you, Phoebe said, echoing advice she had heard many times. Really sees you, not what you look like or what family you come from. You. That's the secret. That sounds hard. It is. But it's worth it. Eleanor nodded solemnly and returned to her butterflies, filing the advice away for some future day when it would matter. And in the garden of Ashworth Park, where the afternoon sun warmed the roses and the laughter of children rang through the air, the Duke and Duchess held each other and knew that they had found something rare and precious, something worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth every battle they had faced and every battle still to come. They had found home. Epilogue, 50 years later. The old Duchess sat by the window, watching the snow fall over the gardens of Ashworth Park. Her hair was silver now, her face lined with the map of a life fully lived. But her eyes, those sharp, intelligent eyes that had once caught an error that saved a fortune, were still bright with awareness. Julian had been gone for 3 years. 3 years of waking alone, of reaching across the bed for a warmth that was no longer there. She had not expected him to go first. He had always been the stronger one, the more formidable one, the one who seemed like he would last forever. But time was the one enemy even the Duke of Ashworth could not defeat. Still, she did not feel alone. The house was full. Eleanor and her family had come for Christmas, along with Marcus and his wife and their 4 boisterous children. Phoebe, now a grandmother herself, arrived yesterday with stories of her latest adventures in philanthropy. The halls rang with laughter and music, and the particular chaos of a family gathered together. A knock at the door. Grandmama? Eleanor's eldest daughter, Margaret, named for the grandmother she had never poked her head in. We're gathering in the drawing room for stories. Would you come? Marguerite smiled. In a moment, dear. I was just remembering. Margaret came into the room and knelt beside her grandmother's chair, taking her weathered hands. Grandmama, will you tell us the story again? Of how you and grandfather met? You've heard it 100 times. I know. But I love it. The contract and the date, and the 4 words that changed everything. Margaret's eyes were bright. Please. Marguerite looked at her granddaughter, this beautiful, intelligent young woman who carried pieces of both her and Julian forward into the future, and felt her heart swell with love. "Very well," she said. "Help me up, and I'll tell it one more time." They walked together to the drawing room, where the fire crackled and the family waited. Marguerite settled into her favorite chair, Julian's chair once, though she had claimed it after he was gone, and looked around at the faces of the people she loved. "It was a gray November afternoon in 1847, she began, "and your grandfather was about to sign away £80,000 to a fraudulent scheme. He was the coldest man in England, they said, the most formidable, the most alone. And then you came," Margaret whispered. "And then I came, a governess with nothing to lose and everything to prove. And I whispered 4 words that changed both our lives forever." "What were the words, Grandmama?" one of the younger children asked, though they all knew. Marguerite smiled, and for just a moment, she could feel Julian beside her, his presence, his warmth, his love that had never wavered, not once in all their years together. "Your Grace, that date is wrong," she said. 4 words, 4 small words, and from that moment, nothing was ever the same. She told the story as she always told it: the investigation, the humiliation at the ball, the declaration on the terrace, the wedding, the children, the lifetime of love that had grown from 4 whispered words. She told them about the night Eleanor was born, when she had nearly slipped away, and Julian had wept at her bedside, confessing fears he had carried since he was 8 years old. She told them about the night Julian had stood in this very room and announced that Phoebe, the unmanageable child no one else had wanted, was formally adopting her, making her his daughter-in-law as well as in heart. And when she was finished, when the children had been sent to bed and the adults sat in companionable silence, Eleanor came to sit beside her mother. "Do you miss him?" she asked quietly. "Every day," Marguerite said. "Every moment. But I also carry him with me in everything I do, everything I am. He made me brave enough to be seen. I made him brave enough to love. We created each other, in a way. And that creation," she gestured around the room, at the family, the legacy, the life they had built, that goes on. "He would be proud," Eleanor said, "of all of this. He would be proud of you," Marguerite corrected. "Of all of you. That was what mattered to him most in the end. Not the money, or the power, or the title. The family, the love, the knowledge that he had not died alone, as he once feared he would." She looked out the window at the snow falling softly over the gardens where she had walked with Julian so many times, and smiled. The last conversation they had had, truly had, before the illness took his mind and then his life, had been in that garden. He had been weak, leaning on her arm, but he had insisted on one more walk among the roses. "Do you remember?" he had asked, his voice thin but still recognizably his. "The day you walked into my study, the day you saved me £80,000. "I remember," she had said. "I have been trying to calculate what I owe you. For that day. For all the days since." He had stopped walking, turned to face her with those winter-gray eyes that had lost none of their intensity even as the rest of him faded. "The interest alone would be astronomical. I'm afraid I can never fully repay you." "You owe me nothing," she had whispered. "You gave me everything." "No." His hand, trembling, had reached up to touch her face. "You gave me everything. A family, a reason to live, a heart I didn't know I had." His voice had cracked. "I wasted so many years, Marguerite. So many years alone, so many years afraid. But the years with you, those weren't wasted. Those were the only years that mattered." She had kissed him then, there in the garden among the roses, and tasted salt on her lips, his tears, or hers, she could not tell. "I love you," he had said. "I have told you every day since Eleanor was born, but I want you to remember. When I'm gone, I want you to remember that I love you, that I always loved you, that loving you was the best and bravest thing I ever did." "You're not going anywhere," she had said, though they both knew it wasn't true. "I am." He had smiled, that rare, beautiful smile that she had worked so hard to earn. "But you're not. You have years ahead of you, my darling. Years to watch our grandchildren grow. Years to tell our story." His eyes had held hers. "Tell them, Marguerite. Tell them that love is worth the risk, that walls keep out pain, but they also keep out joy. Tell them that the bravest thing anyone can do is let themselves be seen." "I will," she had promised. "I'll tell them." Now, in the firelit drawing room with her children and grandchildren around her, Marguerite felt the weight of that promise and the joy of keeping it. "I have been waiting for you all my life," she whispered, remembering words he had spoken on their wedding night. "And I will spend the rest of it ensuring you never regret becoming mine." He had kept that promise, every day, every year, every moment they had shared. And now, in the twilight of her life, Marguerite Holloway Vance, once a governess, once invisible, now and forever, a woman who had been seen and loved, closed her eyes and knew that she would see him again. Soon, soon. Dear listener, maybe you've stood in a doorway, heart pounding, wondering if you should speak or stay silent. Maybe you've watched someone sign something, make a choice, walk a path that you knew was wrong, and you said nothing because you were afraid. Maybe you've been invisible. Maybe you felt like furniture, like a function, like someone the world looks through rather than at. Maybe you've wondered if anyone would notice if you simply disappeared. This story is for you. Marguerite Holloway had nothing. No money, no status, no protection. She had only her mind, her courage, and a conscience that would not let her stay silent. That was enough. It was enough to save a fortune. It was enough to bring criminals to justice. It was enough to earn the love of a man who had forgotten how to love. It was enough to build a legacy that would last for generations. Your voice matters. Your truth matters. Even when everyone around you is looking away. Even when speaking up might cost you everything. Even when you feel like no one is listening. Speak anyway. You never know whose life you might change. You never know who might be waiting, hoping, praying for someone brave enough to tell the truth. Wherever you are listening tonight, whether it's morning, where you are, or the middle of the night, whether you're in bed or on a train or walking through snow, know this: you are not invisible. You are not worthless. You are not alone. Someone sees you. Someone values you. Someone is waiting to know the truth that only you can speak. And somewhere, maybe closer than you think, there is a person whose walls are waiting to be broken down by you, by your courage, by your refusal to stay silent. Thank you for being part of this community. Thank you for your comments and your messages and your presence in my life. You remind me why I tell these stories, not just for entertainment, but because stories have the power to change us, to make us believe in possibilities we had given up on, to remind us that even the coldest heart can learn to love, and even the most invisible person can be seen. Until next time, dear listeners, take care of yourselves, and remember, sometimes the smallest whisper can echo louder than a shout. Good night.